Good afternoon, I'm Dennis Vitorian, and this is the 25th hour, helping you remember everything that happened beyond the 24/7 news cycle. Now, in this week's news for the week of February 7th to 13th, 2021, New York City is making plans to reopen just a little bit after promising declines in COVID numbers. Cuomo is now in full-blown scandal mode after his secretary admitted to a cover-up of nursing home deaths. Trump was acquitted of insurrection, with Biden and Congress getting ready to spend most of their energy on COVID relief. Things may have changed by the time you hear this. Starting with the Blasio, senior citizens in New York City can make a vaccine appointment to 250 stores and pharmacies as a federal program has finally started to deliver vaccines to participating sites. Compounding the racial divide in COVID vaccinations, a CDC study concluded that only 1 out of 3 black New Yorkers eligible for a COVID shot have gotten one. The city health department, due to a low vaccine supply, ended up closing 12 of its 15 neighborhood vaccine sites, with many of those hitting minority neighborhoods such as the Rockaways and Canarsie, which are already reeling from the pandemic and includes hesitancy to get vaccinated. 2 new vaccine sites are slated to open in Brooklyn and Queens, York College in Jamaica, Queens, and Medgar Evers College in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, capable of handling 3,000 people a day each, as vaccine supplies are expected to increase over the incoming weeks. While Yankee Stadium opened up to inoculate Bronx residents, Citi Field will now serve to vaccinate Queens residents, including taxi drivers and food workers. Governor Cuomo said that the city can reopen indoor dining at 25% 2 days earlier than originally announced, pointing to indicators showing lower rates of infections and hospitalizations. But city council members sent a letter to Cuomo saying the city can handle being open even more, at 50%. Cuomo also pushed the curfew put in place earlier to 11 p.m. from 10 p.m. Mayor de Blasio had originally promised that 1 million New Yorkers would get vaccinated in January alone, but that goal has only been reached now, in the middle of February. In response to the city's horrible appointments website for people to get vaccinated, the New York Times highlighted one New Yorker who took matters into his own hands. Huge Ma, an Airbnb software engineer who developed new code for $50, helped people get appointments. New York City's 62,000 remote middle school students can finally come back to school starting the week of February 25th, announced Mayor de Blasio. The latest data shows that little rates of infection stem from schools as long as the right safeguards are in place. Returning high school students is still work in progress. De Blasio said that he was going to reveal a new gifted and talented admissions process next week, weeks after the city announced the G&T test would be the last one to be administered this year, and that the program is going to be revamped in order to be more inclusive. New data released by New York City and reported by Chalkbeat shows that 1 in 4 disabled students, or 48,000 students, aren't getting mandated school services this school year. Maya Wiley has become the latest mayoral candidate to call for the raising of taxes on the wealthy. The problem is that the city can't make such a tax policy change on its own, relying on the state to approve that change. Wiley endorsed bills sponsored by state lawmakers Robert Jackson and Zellner Myrie that would raise the state income tax on those earning between $300,000 and $100 million a year, as well as place a new tax on stock trades, respectively. Sean Donovan ran his first ad of his mayoral candidacy, utilizing the words of his former boss, former President Barack Obama, as Donovan served as his HUD secretary. Pitching for the Orthodox Jewish vote, Andrew Yang said that he won't push to mandate secular education in religious Jewish schools called yeshivas. Yeshivas came under scrutiny after a much-anticipated Department of Education report concluded that more than half of the city's yeshivas aren't teaching the secular curriculum substantially similar to public schools as mandated by law. Yang probably feels buoyed at the moment, with a recent poll from Fontes Advisors and Core Decision Analytics showing that he leads the other mayoral hopefuls at 28% of the survey, with Eric Adams and Scott Stringer following with 10% each. Yang had also cut ties with one of his fundraisers, investor Shervin Pishovar, after Pishovar was accused of sexual misconduct. Yang also came out in favor of removing the city's sidewalk sheds put up by landlords that find it cheaper to put up construction overhead barriers rather than actually fixing their buildings' facades, ripping off a band-aid belied by years-long fights between the city government and developers. Gwen Carr, the mother of Eric Garner, who died at the hands of police, announced that she's endorsing Ray McGuire, the Wall Street executive, for mayor of New York City. The City Board of Elections reported that almost 7,200 city residents have either switched their Republican Party registration to the Democratic Party, or those who are unaffiliated have not designated the Democratic Party as their party. However, a group called Be Counted NYC, which seeks to get conservatives to switch to the Democratic Party in order to gain better political representation, say the count is more likely to be 15,000 due to a lag in the board count. The deadline to register for a party ahead of the June primaries is today, February 14th. The General Counsel of the City Board of Elections, Steve Richmond, officially submitted his retirement to the board amidst misconduct allegations. The Department of Investigations have refused to comment. Councilman Robert Corneghi Jr. has received ringing endorsements out of the gate for his run for Brooklyn Borough President, getting a thumbs up from director Spike Lee and comedian Tracy Morgan. A new study released by the New School Center for New York City Affairs showed that almost 7 in 10 city jobs lost during the pandemic were held by people of color, with retail, nail salons, barbershops, hotels, and restaurants leading the stats. De Blasio ordered a review into New York City's use of the Bronx Parent Housing Shelter Network headed by Victor Rivera, who has been outed by the New York Times to be facing serious sexual abuse allegations. The review also includes all of the other homeless shelter groups that collectively receive about $2 billion in city taxpayer funds. Rivera denies any wrongdoing but has been placed on leave. The New York Times reported that Cuomo's decision for the MTA to briefly close every night between 1 to 5 a.m. for the purpose of disinfecting the subway has eliminated a usual shelter for homeless New Yorkers, leaving them out in the cold. Although de Blasio publicly supported releasing police officers' disciplinary records following the repeal of a law called 50A that contained these records from the public, the City Law Department's Special Federal Litigation Department is still demanding non-disclosure agreements in exchange for releasing those records in court, according to civil rights lawyer Joel Berger. Following criticism about the NYPD being in control of handling press credentials, de Blasio moved responsibility for the administrative movement for the press to the New York City Office of Media and Entertainment. Last summer, at the height of the BLM protests, police either totally disregarded press credentials or threatened to either take away the credentials or refuse to create them against journalists, covering their handling of protests. Despite recent bail reform laws and calls to reduce the city's prisoner population, the city is currently holding the highest number of detainees since April of last year, with 244 people being held on technical parole violations such as failing to report an address change, missing parole meetings, and missing 8 p.m. curfews. At a community meeting in December regarding the development of an affordable housing complex over a former gas plant in Gowanus, Brooklyn, EPA Rep. Christos Tiamas warned that potentially toxic underground fumes can seep into the building even after the site is cleaned before construction. That's per Director of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, Michael Ryan, to write a letter to the EPA admonishing Tiamas for what Ryan called flippant, unsubstantiated statements. Tiamas didn't show up to a subsequent meeting because he went on vacation, but the community group thought he was being punished and supported his speaking out, even if it was out of bureaucratic protocol. The mass media company Condé Nast is withholding its $2.4 million rent from One World Trade, with bond document filings pointing to Condé Nast's desire to reduce its square footage and its rent per square foot. A new analysis by the Department of City Planning showed that richer neighborhoods such as the Upper West Side haven't added any new homes in the past 10 years, and in fact have lost the amount of rental units due to combining of apartments. De Blasio's head of economic development, James Patchett, said he's going to step down next month, saying that he's going to pursue private sector work. The city hasn't announced Patchett's replacement in the Economic Development Corporation yet. Despite there being a state mandate for the MTA to track their spending by comparing how other countries are developing their transportation systems, the MTA doesn't plan on releasing a report detailing how it's doing on time. MTA spokesman Ken Lovett said that the MTA is still in the process of finalizing the report. MTA Chairman Pat Foy told lawmakers that he couldn't figure out how to clean the city's subway system without closing it from 1 to 5 a.m., and that's without giving workers more time to sanitize the trains and stations. NYU released a new research study that found that New York strap hangers face some of the worst air pollution in the New York City subway, with tiny specks of pollution called PM2.5 reaching 251 micrograms per cubic meter, way above the safe levels of 35 micrograms per cubic meter. The subway station at Christopher Street was seen as the most polluted, with particles reaching 1,499 micrograms per cubic meter. The MTA is increasing tolls on bridges and tunnels by 7.1% in April, increasing bridges like the Verrazano toll to $6.55 from $6.12 if the drivers have an easy pass. Moving on to the City Council. Councilman Justin Brannon of Bay Ridge is the latest public official to have received a positive COVID test. Brannon said he's going to work from home and is experiencing mild symptoms. Queens Councilman Francisco Moya, who put forth a plan to build a new soccer stadium in the Willards Point neighborhood, received almost $15,500 in campaign contributions from two owners of the soccer club Queensboro FC, Jonathan Crane and David Villa, according to the Queens Daily Eagle. Moya said that he's going to reimburse any campaign donation over $1,000 because he's participating in the city's public campaign matching program, despite it not being reflected on the Campaign Finance Board's website. City council members who held a virtual meeting to discuss legislation that would protect healthcare workers from discrimination saw some nudie content after Zoom bombers or hackers hijacked the virtual meeting and blasted porno. Lawmakers quickly shut that down. Moving on to Cuomo. As if things weren't bad enough for Governor Cuomo, he's now facing fire at all sides with allegations of a cover-up about the nursing home death undercount. Cuomo's secretary, Melissa DeRosa, said in a virtual meeting with state Democratic lawmakers that a reason why Cuomo's administration delayed giving the state legislature data on nursing homes is because they didn't want the data used against them by a Trump Department of Justice, resulting in the administration freezing up. DeRosa apologized to the lawmakers in the meeting. Cuomo's administration released a transcript of DeRosa's conversation with Democratic lawmakers, saying that it's much ado about nothing and that the administration was transparent throughout the pandemic. Following the shocking revelation, both state Republicans and Democrats decried the administration, calling to subpoena members of Cuomo's administration, revoke his emergency powers, and with some even calling for the need to impeach Governor Cuomo, which is a very unlikely endeavor. Polling firm Zogby reported that 40% of respondents would support a recall effort against Cuomo if they could, before Cuomo finishes his term in November 2022. A new report by the Empire Center for Public Policy concluded that more than 1,500 nursing home residents have died than what was represented by a new death count released by New York State, bringing the total death count of nursing home residents to about 15,000. Cuomo still claims there wasn't an undercount of deaths after the state initially refused to release numbers of dead nursing home residents with COVID that perished in hospitals. The state had also allowed nursing homes to administer experimental drugs like hydroxychloroquine against the warnings of public health officials cautioning against using the drug outside of a hospital setting. Although nursing home policy is to consult with families receiving medication, families of residents who received the experimental drug say they weren't consulted. The governor quietly set up 19 nursing homes that exclusively dealt with COVID, Health Commissioner Howard Zucker revealed in a letter to the state legislature, which it has been asking for months. Leaked emails from Larry Schwartz, Cuomo's vaccination chief, showed that he told hospitals in the state that they can't begin to vaccinate elderly patients until all of the hospital staff members were inoculated first. Schwartz told Time magazine that in no way was it deemed a threat. 1199 SEIU, the country's largest healthcare union, announced that they would pursue changes to nursing home liability protections and increase staffing levels. Despite promises from the Biden administration that vaccine supplies will increase, Cuomo said the state is still only getting about 300,000 a week, creating months-long delays to inoculate those who are currently eligible. Cuomo said that vaccine providers can give someone's second dose to other people if someone doesn't show up for their second dosage appointment within 42 days. In an effort to prop up the entertainment industry in New York, 100 pop-up performances are sprouting up around the state. The governor hopes the performances will lead to increased vaccinations and testing to incentivize a speedier return to theaters. An analysis done by Canberra Systems concluded that Cuomo's experiment of opening up Buffalo Bills games at reduced capacity didn't lead to a rise in COVID cases in Erie County, setting up evidence that opening up stadiums for limited attendance can work. Cuomo said that starting February 23rd, spectators can watch the Knicks and Nets in person as well. Stadiums are only allowed to let in 10% of their capacity, and fans have to test negative before attending the games. Times Union reported that the Cuomo administration is stonewalling attempts at accessing paperwork showing Cuomo followed state ethics rules in writing his book on his leadership in the beginning of the pandemic. A lawsuit from Legal Aid revealed a stark catch-22 with the state's eviction moratorium, and that the state can help a tenant avoid eviction, but they'd have to be sometimes sued in housing court in order to get that help. The Board of Regents announced that they are choosing fellow former Chancellor Betty Rosa as the new Commissioner of Education and the University of the State of New York President. Dr. Rosa was the acting Education Commissioner after Shannon Tahoe stepped down, and she now becomes the first Latina woman in the position. Newsday reported that 50 of Long Island's school districts are set to lose money under an aid proposal released by the state, saying that Newsday's own analysis showed that the state budget plan recently released by Cuomo would present the biggest losses to school districts since the Great Recession 10 years ago. Michael Rosen resigned as chairman of the Joint Commission on Public Ethics, the state's corruption watchdog, with it now being immediately clear why Rosen was resigning. Former Cuomo staffer Camille Joseph Varlak is taking Rosen's place. Despite the body's mission to investigate corruption, it has been seen as toothless, especially in the face of investigations against Cuomo himself, with reporting indicating political interference by the governor. The state's new Public Campaign Finance Board had elected their two new members, the chair and vice chair. Ikao Yanka was elected chair, and Brian Cobb was elected vice chair. The new board is tasked with setting up a public campaign finance system by 2024. The State Redistricting Commission has refused to accept a $1 million contract to conduct redistricting work despite pleading for funding for months. They refused the contract because of what they call legal gymnastics that were necessary to pay the commissioners for their work looking at redrawing the state's electoral districts. The commissioners also said that the $1 million contract is cut up in a way that would actually pay the commissioners $650,000 after fees were taken out. According to a new analysis conducted by the Center of New York City Affairs at the New School, legalizing marijuana can create almost 51,000 jobs and add $6 billion in economic output by 2027. Cuomo's budget proposal would move about $160 million in state funds dedicated to the state's mass transit systems into the state's general fund, further removing much-needed money from the state's cash-strapped transportation agencies. More video has emerged from the incident involving Rochester police pepper spraying a 9-year-old girl. The video shows a police officer telling the 9-year-old that she, quote, did this to herself. Two Buffalo police officers, Aaron Torgalski and Robert McCabe, were cleared by a grand jury of criminal charges for shoving a 75-year-old protester, Martin Gugino, during BLM protests, resulting in the elderly man with sustained head injuries, including bleeding from the ear. The police department is now going to initiate its own internal affairs investigation. It's not clear what the grand jury based their vote on. Moving on to Albany, the Assembly Tourism Committee advanced a bill to rename the state's Donald J. Trump State Park, named for Trump in 2015, but has been largely undeveloped and deteriorating. The bill would rename the park after Heather Heyer, the murdered counter-protester who was hit by a car driven by a Nazi sympathizer at Charlottesville in 2017. The state Senate approved a series of bills aimed at ending housing discrimination following an investigation by Newsday that revealed shocking housing discrimination practices on Long Island. The bills mandate harsher penalties and anti-bias training for real estate agents and undercover home buyers to reveal shady discriminatory practices. The bills go on to the Assembly. The state Senate advanced a bill that would remove immunity from former presidents of any criminal acts by running the statute of limitations during the period they served as president, when they have immunity in general. Senator Mike Gennari supports the bill, happening in the midst of multiple investigations against Trump and his company in New York State. Assemblywoman Uline New and State Senator Brad Hoylman introduced a bill that would make the state translate all of its websites for non-English speakers with emphasis on any sites that provide COVID information. Moving on to the state judiciary. Before the governor pushed New York's restaurant curfew to 11 p.m., U.S. Southern District Judge Paul Crotty upheld Cuomo's 10 p.m. curfew in the face of efforts by restaurants and bars to get the curfew lifted, with Judge Crotty saying Cuomo was entitled to put the curfew in place due to the police powers delegated to the state executive and legislative branch, which handed Cuomo emergency powers in the beginning of the pandemic. In a separate case, State Appellate Division Associate Justice Patrick Niemoyer lifted a temporary restraining order against the curfew in Erie and Monroe counties, putting the curfew back in place for those regions. The state's highest appellate court, the Court of Appeals, has ruled that Trump's former campaign manager Paul Manafort cannot be tried for the same crimes of fraud in the state of New York as the crimes he was convicted of in federal court. The U.S. Constitution forbids what's called double jeopardy, which is generally when someone is tried for the same crime. However, Supreme Court precedent says that because the federal and state governments are considered separate sovereigns, double jeopardy doesn't apply when a defendant is tried for a similar crime by a state as was tried by the federal government. The difference here is that New York State has its own double jeopardy law that forbids prosecution of a state crime that bears resemblance to a federal conviction. The state legislature had passed a bill that Cuomo signed into law that would not let those who Trump pardoned off the hook for state offenses while a president is in office, but Manafort's pardon happened before the law was passed, giving him luck. The firms that built the $4 billion Mario Cuomo Bridge sued the state throughway authority in the Court of Claims, the court that handles lawsuits against the state, saying the transportation agency's delays led to increased expenses the agency isn't paying. The firms are asking for $961 million in financial relief. Core Development Company, a Syracuse-based company, sued the Joint Commission on Public Ethics in state Supreme Court, alleging that the Public Ethics Commission didn't open into legal lobbying investigation against the company in time as mandated by law, so now it doesn't count. Two of the company's executives, Stephen Aiello and Joseph Girardi, were convicted of hatching an illegal scheme to win state contracts to former president of SUNY Polytechnic Institute, Alan Caballeros. A group of city elected officials and candidates sued Cuomo and de Blasio in Manhattan Supreme Court to forego the petitioning process to get on the June primary ballot. Public advocate Jumaane Williams, mayoral candidates Eric Adams, Scott Stringer, and Maya Wiley, among other candidates for office, would usually have to gain signatures to get on the ballot, but are arguing that due to the pandemic and the risk of either getting themselves or others sick, petitioning should be called off completely. The state had lowered the required amount of signatures needed, but moved up the deadline. New York Attorney General Letitia James sued a couple of Planned Parenthood protesters, alleging that the protesters intimidated people at a Manhattan Planned Parenthood and disrupted operations. Protesting abortions at Planned Parenthood are a traditional First Amendment issue, as protesters are known to employ extreme tactics to either persuade women not to get abortions or prevent the clinics from doing other business, as well as figuring out the issue on how to strike the right balance between protecting women getting abortions in Planned Parenthood and the protesters' First Amendment rights to protest. Manhattan Supreme Court Judge Frank Nervo rejected an attempt by a group of Lower East Side residents and business plaintiffs to stop the city's efforts to open a temporary homeless shelter at the Blue Moon Hotel, with Judge Nervo saying the plaintiffs lacked standing to sue and didn't prove they faced damages from the shelter plans. Dealey Silberstein and Braverman LLP, which represents the Lower East Side plaintiffs, plan to appeal the decision. State Supreme Court Justice Patrick McGrath struck down this week the use of secret subpoenas employed in internal probes by New York State Police. Before the ruling, there was an open secret wherein state police were known to have used subpoenas to go through personnel records of employees in internal investigations without those employees' knowledge, which was counter to the public officers law, according to Justice McGrath. The New York State Police Investigators Association brought the lawsuit against the state police. Moving on to Biden. As the country is seeing a slowdown in infections and hospitalizations as well as an impending new one-shot vaccine, public health officials are still debating whether second-dose shots should be sent out for first-time vaccine takers or whether they should be reserved for those who need to take their second doses. Dr. Fauci is on the latter side, saying it's more important that the country to make sure people are completing their dosing regimens. While Congress works with the administration to pass the COVID relief bill, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said that those who earn up to $60,000 a year should get a full stimulus check. President Biden continues to temper expectations on how quickly the U.S. is going to escape the pandemic, saying that a herd immunity gained from vaccinations won't appear until possibly Thanksgiving. Race and ethnicity data on who's getting vaccinated is still lagging, only possessing information on 52% of vaccine recipients. Biden complained this week that Trump didn't do his job handling the pandemic, making it more difficult for Biden's team to correct mistakes. Biden met with corporate executives this week to build support for his COVID plan, sitting down with Walmart, Gap, Lowe's, and J.P. Morgan Chase. The CDC released research concluding that tight masks, or doubling up on masks, could reduce COVID transmission by up to 96.5%, in a push to get Americans to mask up in general in light of new viral variants spreading throughout the country. A CBS News YouGov survey found that 83% of Americans favor the current path Congress is taking with COVID relief, with 40% saying the economic relief package is too small and 39% saying it's just right. The CDC also released new guidance saying that no quarantine is necessary for those who have received both doses of their vaccine, and 2 weeks have passed since then. The Department of Homeland Security is investigating a massive counterfeit N95 mask operation which sold fake 3M masks to 5 states, including hospitals and government agencies. As COVID mutation strains are surging in states like Florida, Biden is considering imposing new domestic travel restrictions, but that no announcements are imminent. White House spokesman Kevin Munoz also said that there are no plans to mandate pre-departure COVID tests. The president said that the U.S. has struck a deal to gain a total of 200 million more vaccine doses from Pfizer and Moderna, raising the total number of vaccines ordered from the two companies to 600 million, reaching closer to Biden's goal to have enough vaccine doses to inoculate a vast majority of the U.S. population. After the CDC said last week that schools can reopen with COVID protections in place, CBS reports that the agency is considering putting schools into color-coded classifications to phase reopenings. In its guidance, the CDC said it's not necessary for every teacher to get vaccinated in order for schools to reopen. A Lancet Commission report concluded that about 40% of COVID deaths could have been prevented if former President Trump had created a more robust national response to the pandemic and didn't stir divisions about mask wearing. The FDA agreed that Moderna can increase their vaccine supply in each vial, which would be a faster way to bolster the low vaccine supplies around the nation. The FDA still wants Moderna to send data proving that the move wouldn't lower vaccine quality. A new Congressional Budget Office report concluded that an increase to $15 in the federal minimum wage would raise 900,000 Americans out of poverty and raise the incomes of 17 million workers, but with the caveat of creating 1.4 million unemployed Americans by 2025, due to employers presumably not being able to afford the increased labor cost. The report provides political use for both Republicans and Democrats as Biden and Congress debate how to pass the $15 increase. The Labor Department's weekly jobs report showed that jobless claims fell slightly to 793,000, with 20.3 million people receiving jobless aid for the week ending January 23rd. The U.S. economy added only 49,000 jobs in January. The Congressional Budget Office forecasted that the federal budget deficit is on track to reach $2.3 trillion for the current fiscal year, and that the deficit would be the second biggest since World War II. The question has been raised as to how much Trump's lies cost the American taxpayer, and we actually have an estimate now thanks to the Washington Post, which said Trump's lies cost taxpayers about $519 million due to governments of different levels having to increase security in the face of protests based on false premises, repairing property damage, and mounting legal defenses to spurious claims in courtrooms. Georgia's Secretary of State has opened an official investigation into Trump's attempt to overthrow the 2020 presidential election results in the state, stemming from Trump's phone call to the Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger to find almost 12,000 votes, as well as pressuring public officials to launch spurious investigations into the presidential election in Georgia. A Washington Post analysis found that a majority of the people arrested for the Capitol insurrection were either currently facing or had faced a slew of financial troubles, including bankruptcies, evictions, foreclosures, and unpaid taxes, underscoring how financial problems led to radicalizing Trump supporters to take a more violent edge to their political actions. A declassified June 2018 report by the Accountability Review Board showed that the Trump administration didn't reveal incidents where U.S. diplomats were reporting mysterious brain injuries in Cuba until news reports shed light on the incidents themselves and characterized the Trump administration's actions as slow and chaotic. The New York Times reported that according to 4 people who are familiar with the situation, former President Trump's COVID diagnosis was more dire than previously acknowledged. Officials believe that the situation was so bad with the president that he would have needed to be placed on a ventilator, and Trump's blood oxygen levels going down into the 80s when the virus was considered severe if someone's levels went down to the 90s. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken announced the U.S. is ending the Trump-era asylum cooperative agreements, which sent asylum applicants to El Salvador, Guatemala, or Honduras with the goal of equitably spreading around asylees, despite the 3 Central American countries not being able to adequately provide refuge due to political and economic circumstances in those countries. The Washington Post reported that according to emails and memos, ICE is preparing to issue new guidance on what deportation agents are going to prioritize, shifting away from immigrants that commit misdemeanors such as assault and driving under the influence to greater national security concerns such as recent border crossers and those who committed aggravated felonies. A freeze on continued border wall construction has put eminent domain cases in court in limbo. Biden informed Congress this week that he was terminated the national emergency declaration put in place by Trump in 2019 that was used to legally divert funds from the Pentagon to build a border wall against Mexico after Congress rejected providing taxpayer funds for the effort. Biden said that a review of the declaration determined it was unwarranted. Defense Secretary General Lloyd Austin issued a memo ordering commanding officers to hold a one-day stand down in order to discuss extremism with their troops within the next 60 days in an effort to root out political extremists following proof that current and former military members participated in the Capitol insurrection on January 6th. Biden also announced a review of the prison at Guantanamo Bay, the Cuban island known to house convicted terrorists and those awaiting trial. Former President Obama wanted to close the facility amidst claims of illegal torture, but he couldn't get it done. Continuing a tradition the new president undertake, Biden has asked nearly all of Trump's appointed prosecutors in the Department of Justice to resign, with the exception of Trump's appointees leading politically sensitive investigations into Hunter Biden and the origins of the investigation looking into how involved Trump's campaign was with Russia's attempt to interfere in the 2016 presidential election. Federal prosecutors are looking into drug trafficking and conspiracy charges against Honduras President Juan Orlando Hernandez, with President Hernandez calling the allegations 100% false. Justice Department spokesman Mark Raimondi confirmed that the U.S. has filed a brief in British court to overturn a ruling not to extradite WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to the U.S. to face charges related to publishing leaked classified military documents in 2010 given to him by former soldier Chelsea Manning that, while exposed U.S. handling of collateral damage after drone strikes revealed confidential sources for the U.S. military. Assange was accused of sexual assault in Sweden and took refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy in London to escape extradition there, living there for almost 7 years before the Ecuadorian ambassador turned him out. Assange was afraid that the sexual assault charges were a ruse to instead send him to the U.S. The British judge refused to approve Assange's extradition to the U.S. on espionage charges due to the inhumane conditions in American prisons. The Department of Housing and Urban Development announced that it is going to pursue gender and identity-based discrimination complaints, a reversal from policy put in place by former Secretary Ben Carson during Trump's presidency. A new Transportation Safety Board report released about the tragic Kobe Bryant helicopter crash finally concluded that the helicopter pilot violated federal rules when he flew into fog, which subsequently disoriented the pilot. When the pilot, Awaz Abayan, was telling air traffic controllers he was climbing up, he was actually moving his helicopter to the left on a rapid descent, a typical symptom of spatial disorientation leading to the deaths of all 9 people on board, including Kobe Bryant and his daughter Gianna. This month is a big one in the race for exploring Mars. The U.S. is joined by China and the UAE as the list of countries who are set to land on the red planet this month to explore Mars terrain and the environment. Postmaster General Louis DeJoy, who is still in charge of the USPS, released his new plans to reform the United States Postal Service, including putting first-class mail on a single delivery track, which would make deliveries slower and costlier, as well as keeping those deliveries just on trucks instead of also on airplanes, increasing the cost of postage rates. Despite Biden's promise to his staff that anyone that disrespects others would be fired on the spot, T.J. Ducklo, White House Deputy Press Secretary, was originally suspended for 1 week without pay after threatening to, quote, destroy political reporter Terry Palmieri, but then resigned completely and called his own behavior disgusting. The U.S. Census Bureau's Chief of Decennial Communications and Stakeholder Relations, Kathleen Stiles, said that redistricting data won't be available until the end of September, with the biggest reason being COVID, according to Stiles. The census is constitutionally mandated every 10 years and is used to measure the U.S. population, which affects congressional representation, election district sizes, and congressional funds. Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei said his country won't come back to the negotiating table for the U.S. to re-enter the Iranian nuclear deal until the U.S. reverses sanctions against Iran. The nuclear deal was spurred by Obama leading Iran and other countries to agree they will ease sanctions in exchange for Iran not to enrich its nuclear materials enough to make a bomb. The deal was highly unpopular with Republicans, and Trump backed out of the deal and slapped sanctions back on it, a maximum pressure policy, with Iran since then skyrocketing its nuclear program. Biden's position is that Iran needs to scale back its nuclear program before the U.S. agrees to reverse sanctions. Over this week, Iranian Intelligence Minister Mahmoud Alavi said that Iran could end up pushing for nuclear weapons due to being backed so far into the corner by other nations' sanctions. The International Atomic Energy Agency reported that Iran has started to produce uranium metal in violation of the 2015 agreement, which could then be used to form a core of a nuclear weapon. The Military Times reported that the U.S. military has gone a full year without a single combat death in Afghanistan for the first time since the start of the U.S. invasion 20 years ago. The Taliban tempered hopes by saying the terrorist groups could still target U.S. soldiers if the peace agreement struck between them and the U.S. is violated. The White House confirmed that it is keeping the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem after former President Trump constructed a new embassy there and recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital. The Senate passed an amendment supporting keeping the embassy in Jerusalem, with the White House releasing a statement saying the ultimate status of Jerusalem will need to be resolved by the parties in direct negotiations. Critics were against the move of the embassy to Jerusalem, as well as recognizing it as the capital because it was seen as a unilateral move that would kill any dwindling hopes for peace between Israel and the Palestinians. Biden and Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu haven't spoken yet, but with the White House denying Biden is snubbing Netanyahu in the midst of Israeli PM facing corruption charges wherein he allegedly worked out favorable news coverage with Israeli networks in exchange for tax breaks. Secretary of State Blinken announced that the Biden administration will rejoin the U.S. at the UN Human Rights Council, the international body tasked with overseeing the world's human rights and their consequent abuses. The council has received major criticism for letting countries with their own blighted human rights abuses join, and sometimes even lead the council. Trump backed the U.S. out of the body, citing political bias, which led to more autocratic countries to have more of a say in the council without the U.S.'s presence. Biden held his first phone call as president with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The two leaders talked about climate change and democratic values, according to a readout of the call. India is currently the third largest carbon dioxide emitter after China and the U.S., and the country is currently embroiled in the largest political protest in history, with 250 million farmers objecting to a new proposed law that would privatize the Indian farming industry, which is already saturated by poor farmers staking a small corner of the business for themselves. Biden also held a 2-hour call with Chinese President Xi Jinping, discussing various topics such as trade, human rights, and free naval navigation in the Asian region. Biden reportedly expressed concern about China's unfair trade practices, crackdown on Hong Kong, and putting Muslim Uyghurs in concentration camps, intimidation against Taiwan, as well as other Southern Pacific nations with island building. Biden later told reporters that China would eat our lunch if the U.S. doesn't get moving and positioning itself against the Asian nation. 2 U.S. carrier ships, the Theodore Roosevelt Carrier Strike Group and the Nimitz Carrier Strike Group, conducted naval exercises in the South China Sea this week. Biden also hit pause on a plan to ban the popular social media video app TikTok and force its sale due to national security concerns stemming from TikTok's Chinese ownership. A federal court filing from the Department of Justice signals a drop in legal proceedings. Biden's administration followed through on threats to sanction the Myanmar military after it pulled off a coup against the government. Myanmar military leaders were targeted with sanctions totaling $1 billion and prohibited government funds held in the U.S. Moving on to Congress and starting in the House. House Democrats unveiled their version of the COVID stimulus plan, rebuffing calls to negotiate down who gets stimulus checks based on their income. The House Democrat plan gives $1,400 checks to individuals making up to $75,000 a year and couples making $150,000 a year. Moderate Democrats called for a $50,000 a year limit on individuals. Due to pushback from moderate Democrats on a $15 minimum wage increase, House Democrats are hammering out a plan to increase the minimum wage gradually until it hits $15 an hour in 2025, as Senator Bernie Sanders proposed. Texas Republican Representative Ron Wright died from COVID-exacerbated complications due to cancer treatment this week at 67, becoming the first member of Congress to die from COVID. After Utah Senator Mitt Romney introduced his bill to give parents $3,000 per child, ages 6 to 17, to help raise their kids, Democrats released their own proposal led by House Ways and Means Chairman Democrat Richard Neal. The proposal would also give parents $3,000 per 16 to 17-year-old, with the difference with the Romney plan being that there is an income phase-out for those making above $75,000 a year for individuals and $150,000 a year for couples, as well as not eliminating other welfare programs to make room for the subsidies, but rather the qualifications for the subsidy to tax information. Columbia University concluded in an analysis that the plan would cut child poverty in the U.S. by 54%, but critics say tying income to tax information isn't connected to families' fluctuating income. Democrats seek to place Neal's plan in the COVID relief bill. After surviving a vote to strip her leadership post in the House, Wyoming Representative Liz Cheney was censured by his state's Republican Party for her vote to impeach Trump and called on her to resign. Cheney defended her vote, saying she was following her oath to the Constitution. Representative Tom Rice was similarly censured in South Carolina. New York Republican Claudia Tenney was certified the winner of the last House election to be called from last year. Democrat Anthony Brindisi was set to appeal part of the New York judge's ruling that gave Tenney the 109-vote lead, and the case only laid bare the vulnerabilities of the county boards of election and how they administer the vote count. Brindisi ultimately decided to concede later in the week and called Tenney to congratulate her and inform her that he's dropping his appeals. Officials are calling for the resignation of the Oneida County's Board of Elections commissioners in light of the messy vote count in the district. Tenney took her oath of office this week. In the Senate, former President Trump's second impeachment trial had officially started, with Trump's defense team and the House impeachment team arguing first about the constitutionality of convicting a former president. Most legal scholars, including conservative ones, conclude that it's constitutional to convict a former president due to the ambiguous wording in the Constitution, the consequence of barring someone from future office, the precedent the former War Secretary Belknap tried after trying to resign right before his trial, and the ramifications of letting a president escape wrongdoing just because he finished his term. The first day of the trial looked into the constitutionality question, with the House impeachment manager showing compelling emotional videos of what transpired on January 6th, and Trump's lawyers giving a panned, rambling speech denouncing the trial. 6 Republicans voted with every Senate Democrat to declare the trial of a former president constitutional, including Republican Bill Cassidy, who said he voted with the Democrats based purely on the poor arguments made by Trump's counsel. House managers moved forward with the substantive claims in the one article of impeachment against Trump the next day. Trump was reportedly very unhappy with his lawyers' efforts on the first day, whereas Biden continued to publicly say he was ignoring the trial because of the demands of his office. The House managers went on to give a presentation breaking down the timeline of the Capitol insurrection, including showing new footage never publicly shown of how close the terrorists were to Republican and Democratic lawmakers, including Mike Pence and Mitt Romney. Senate Republicans who voted against the constitutionality of Trump's trial said that the House impeachment manager's presentation, although emotionally compelling, still failed to persuade them that Trump directly incited the Capitol insurrection, creating a hopeless situation for anyone who wanted to hold the former president accountable despite the evidence. After the House impeachment managers rested their case, saying refusing to convict Trump would lead to more violence because it legitimizes political violence, Trump's defense team took only 3 hours to argue that the House impeachment managers didn't meet their burden to show Trump should be convicted of conducting high crimes and misdemeanors, as well as pressing the theory that Trump's First Amendment rights protect him when he spoke of fighting to stop the steal, playing a montage of Democratic leaders using the word fight in other political contexts. After the defense rested, there was a Q&A portion of the trial, which included a testing moment between Trump's lawyer Michael Van Der Veen and Bernie Sanders. Although the questions submitted to the lawyers are anonymous, Van Der Veen asked who wrote this, after reading a question asking whether the defense lawyers believe Trump lost the 2020 election. Bernie Sanders called out that he had asked the question, and Van Der Veen said that the defense's views on whether or not Trump lost the election are irrelevant, prompting an audible groan in the chamber. Then reporting came out that directly contradicted the defense team's assertion that Trump didn't delay his actions calling off the Capitol insurrectionists and that he didn't know his Vice President Mike Pence was in direct danger, with Alabama Senator Tommy Tuberville being one example of Trump knowing his vice president was in danger when Tuberville informed Trump of Pence's evacuation. And Washington State Representative Jamie Herrera Butler said that she was present when House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy was on the phone with the president asking him to call off the rioters. The president at first denied his supporters were behind the insurrection, saying Antifa was ransacking the Capitol, but then McCarthy, who was inside the Capitol, told Trump directly that wasn't true. in which Trump said, "Well, I guess they're more upset about the election than you are." McCarthy reportedly asked the president, "Who the F do you think you're talking to?" Pence's staff, who were carrying the nuclear football, which are codes to the nation's nuclear missiles that get carried around the president and vice president, were also in potential danger unbeknownst to military officials, discovering the fact for the first time when videos were presented at the trial showing Pence's evacuation from the Capitol. As reporting heated up in the final hour, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell expressed his intentions to vote to acquit Trump, and an account of more than 24 Republican senators were skipping out on the trial despite their oath to serve as jurors. Right after that, the Senate, led by Democrats, voted to allow witnesses and more evidence in light of Trump's state of mind while the insurrection was going on, starting with Rep. Butler, who reported on Trump's call with McCarthy, but the vote was undone after senators reached a compromise not to hear witnesses in exchange for simply reading out Butler's testimony on the Senate floor. Senator Mike Lee, a Republican from Utah, also turned over his phone log as evidence showing that he talked to President Trump for 4 minutes in the middle of the riot. There was a brief moment of levity later in the week when both Democrats and Republicans came together to honor Capitol Police Officer Eugene Goodman with the Congressional Gold Medal, who didn't just lead Capitol rioters away from lawmakers, but also was shown saving Mitt Romney's life. All in all, when it came down to it, and after both the House impeachment managers and Trump's defense counsel gave their closing arguments, the vote was 57-42 to acquit Trump. The Senate constitutionally has to reach a two-thirds vote to convict someone for their impeachment, and Democrats just didn't have 17 Republicans to rely on, although the 7 Republicans they swayed represents the most bipartisan impeachment conviction vote in history. Trump, not able to use the social media that was traditionally his bullhorn due to the bans put in place against him, thanked the Republicans that voted to acquit him and said that his MAGA movement is just beginning. Mitch McConnell took the podium after the vote and railed against Trump, saying that although McConnell voted to acquit Trump because he doesn't think the Senate can convict a former president, Trump was responsible for the Capitol insurrection. Arizona Democratic Senator Kyrsten Sinema became the latest moderate Democrat to refuse to allow the $15 minimum wage increase to be part of the COVID bill. Sinema said that she doesn't agree that the measure would meet the rules of the budget reconciliation measure process and doesn't want unrelated policy measures in the COVID relief bill. Sinema and West Virginia Democratic Senator Joe Manchin have outsized power in the 50-50 split between Democrats and Republicans. Republican Alabama Senator Richard Shelby became the 4th Republican senator to announce their resignation by the end of their term in 2022. Shelby has been one of Alabama's senators for 35 years, first as a Democrat and then switching to the Republican Party in 1994. Senators Portman of Ohio, Toomey of Pennsylvania, and Burr of North Carolina have also announced their retirements, but the difference with Shelby is that his seat doesn't represent an opportunity for Democrats to take over, as Alabama continues to be a Republican stronghold. The Senate cleared Biden's pick for Secretary of Veterans Affairs, Obama's former Chief of Staff Dennis McDonough, 87-7. McDonough isn't a vet, although he stressed his many years of managing government bureaucracy as a reason why he can steer the agency's problems into the clear. The VA's biggest issues include providing veterans with adequate and timely health care. Biden's pick to lead the Office of Management and Budget, Neera Tanden, apologized to senators for her past tweets admonishing Republicans. Tanden, who leads the Center for American Progress, a liberal think tank, went after Republicans for their actions in the past 4 years, and when Republican senators went after Tanden for her tweets, calling it bullying, critics pointed out the hypocrisy of the Republican Party standing by former President Trump's behavior. The Senate Judiciary Committee finally scheduled the nomination hearing on Biden's next Attorney General, Merrick Garland, picking February 22nd and 23rd for hearings and a vote out of committee on March 1st. Moving on to the federal judiciary. The escape plotters that helped former chairman of Nissan, Carlos Ghosn, help escape from Japan have been given the green light from the Supreme Court to be extradited to Japan. Ghosn was accused of financial misconduct charges in Japan last year, which Ghosn denied, but then the former Nissan chairman mysteriously disappeared after he wasn't found in his home. It turns out that U.S. Army Special Forces veteran Michael Taylor and his son Peter snuck Ghosn out of Japan in a box and placed him on a private jet to Lebanon. The Taylors went on home to the U.S., but Japan requested their extradition, which the Supreme Court refused to intervene in a lower court ruling to stop. Normally, the Supreme Court is wary of intervening in death penalty cases, but this week the High Court intervened and stopped an execution so that an inmate can have a pastor at his side. Willie B. Smith III, who was convicted on kidnapping, theft, and murder charges, challenged an Alabama policy that would have made an inmate's spiritual advisor observe the execution from another room due to COVID. This isn't the first time the Supreme Court stopped an execution because an inmate's spiritual advisor wasn't in the room, continuing a trend that the court believes excluding those advisors is an Eighth Amendment violation. Smith was returned to his holding cell while the state figured out a way to get Smith's pastor in the execution room. One interesting note behind the decision is who sided with the liberals, newly appointed conservative Justice Amy Coney Barrett. The Second Circuit upheld New York State rules that restricted access to the ballot this week, with the 3-judge panel saying the state has the right to declutter their ballots and prevent voter confusion when it comes to how parties get on the ballots. The plaintiffs, the Serve America Movement Party, around since 2018, sued to challenge New York's new rules that would put its status as a party in danger of disbanding due to higher vote thresholds to exist, and the ruling now puts it on the chopping block. Moving on to national news. The U.S. has logged 27.6 million COVID cases and 484,000 deaths to date. A recent study from genomics company Helix and Scripps University confirms that a UK variant of COVID that is a more contagious variant will become the dominant strain in the US by March, underscoring the need for Americans to remain vigilant. Facebook announced this week after consultation with the World Health Organization that it is now cracking down on anti-vaccine misinformation posts, a reversal from their policy of leaving those posts alone, and following a playbook it has with how it handled COVID misinformation posts. The World Health Organization in recent weeks has finally gained access to China's COVID hotspots to investigate the origins of the virus. Although hopes aren't high for the team to gain full transparency from the Chinese government, which covered up the pandemic until the last second and denied it was the catalyst of the pandemic, the team was able to confirm that the virus jumped from animals to humans, as well as it being highly unlikely the virus originated from a lab leak, as some conspiracy theories posit. China refused to give the WHO team raw data on early COVID cases. A story of hope can be found this week with the knowledge that the world's second oldest person, 116-year-old French nun, Sister Andre, survived a bout with COVID. America's annual love for football took place this past Sunday with the Super Bowl featuring a matchup between the Kansas City Chiefs led by upstart quarterback Patrick Mahomes and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers led by their newest quarterback Tom Brady and his trusty tight end Robert Gronkowski routed the Chiefs 31-9. Brady now has 7 Super Bowl rings and has made 11 Super Bowl appearances. A group of minority corrections officers filed a lawsuit in Minnesota alleging that they were prevented from guarding accused killer of George Floyd, former police officer Derek Chauvin, who put his knee on the neck of Floyd, killing him, as seen in haunting videos that precipitated last year's BLM protests. The corrections officers allege that Chauvin is getting favorable treatment from a white lieutenant and that minority officers were reassigned away from Chauvin. NBC News reported that Chauvin was prepared to plead guilty to third-degree murder, but the plea deal was rejected personally by Trump's former Attorney General, Bill Barr, with sources saying the Department of Justice didn't want to rush a deal. Kenosha County Circuit Court Judge Bruce Schroeder in Wisconsin refused to issue a new arrest warrant against 18-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse, who faces murder charges for killing 2 demonstrators at the Jacob Blake protest in Wisconsin after it was seen that Rittenhouse violated the condition of his bail by failing to update the court with the new address. The judge told Rittenhouse's lawyers to give prosecutors the new address. At least 6 people are dead following a pileup on a Texas highway due to icy conditions, wrecking about 130 cars and trucks that slammed into each other and saw videos of cars flipping over when hit by 18-wheelers unable to stop. Big pharmaceutical companies are trying to claim $1 billion in tax deductions after settling in lawsuits related to their role in the opioid epidemic. Johnson & Johnson, McKesson, Cardinal Health, and AmerisourceBergen might get their deductions challenged by the IRS, but the CARES Act might give the companies an out for their assistance during the pandemic. We had a series of deaths this week. The heavyweight boxer that gave Muhammad Ali a run for his money when he beat him in 1978, Leon Spinks, has died on February 6th at the age of 67 from cancer. Among his other accolades, Spinks earned a gold medal in boxing in the Montreal Olympics in 1976. Former Secretary of State under Reagan, George Shultz, died this week at 100 years old. Aside from state, he was only one of 2 people aside from Elliot Richardson to hold 4 or more cabinet posts, including OMB Director, Labor Secretary, and Treasury Secretary, all under Nixon. Shultz also served in the Eisenhower administration. Shultz's legacy will be cemented over his push to Reagan to get closer to the former Soviet Union, which eventually led to a thaw in the Cold War, and the signing of the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which limited the amount of nuclear missiles held by the 2 superpowers. Shultz was also instrumental in getting Reagan a call for ending American assistance to Filipino leader Ferdinand Marcos after he lost his election but refused to give up power in 1985, as well as advocating for the bombing of Libya for its role in the 1986 Berlin disco bombing that killed 2 American soldiers, pushing Palestinian Liberation Organization head Yasser Arafat to cease terrorist attacks on Israel and recognize the Jewish nation's right to exist. When it came to Nixon's Watergate and Reagan's Iran-Contra scandal, Shultz advocated for truth and transparency, although he was criticized for not being more forceful with Reagan on the latter. George Shultz said that the most important thing in government is trust. The rest are just details. A founding member of the Motown group, the Supremes, Mary Wilson, died this week at 76 from cardiovascular disease. The Supremes are known for classics such as Stop in the Name of Love and Come See About Me. Wilson later went on to her own solo career. The former publisher of Hustler magazine, Larry Flynt, died this week at 78. The porn magazine publisher was at the forefront of First Amendment cases against governments trying to censor him, pointing to lewd or obscene material. Flynt would win court battles that would inadvertently advance the cause of First Amendment supporters. And legendary jazz keyboard pianist Chick Corea died this week of cancer at 79 years of age. Corea played along greats such as Miles Davis and was a 23-time Grammy Award winner. That's it for this week's show on the 25th hour, helping you beat the 24/7 news cycle every Sunday afternoon. I ask that you please rate, subscribe, and share this podcast to your friends. And don't forget to become a patron today at patreon.com/the25thhournews. As always, you can email your tips and suggestions at the25thhournews@gmail.com. Follow us on most of your social media platforms and spread New York City's soon-to-be top-rated political podcast. and have a happy Valentine's Day.